Hi, welcome everyone. Pleasure to be with you today. So, even though I am an active participant in standardization, sharing the work on the Sense standards for the AI Act, as well as previously having been a chair for an IEEE standard, my role at UI is actually in the global public policy team. And so I thought perhaps one way to start my intervention is to reflect a bit on the policy dimension and where it is that standards play a role here. Obviously, AI it's a new field for policymakers to engage with. It is an area where there is a lot of public attention as well to see what are they doing, are they going to get it right? And it is a space where there is a lot of tension between the need to be seen to support innovation, to support greater uptake of this technology, because it is seen to have such great potential to energize economies, but at the same time, how to make sure that it won't disrupt the society in a way that will have negative consequences, especially on those who are weaker in society and who are generally not going to be the ones in control of the levers that decide how AI is developed or how it's being deployed. So this is the challenge that policymakers are facing. And so they're looking at what do they need to do in order to put in place the right kind of regulations. Back in 2017, 2018, we saw a lot of focus on figuring out what should be the principles behind how to think about policies in this kind of space. And this was really coalesced by the OECD AI principles that got adopted by the G20 and are really a common baseline that pretty much all jurisdictions look at. You may see some variations in how they're being written up, but they provide a strong common baseline. And this, of course, gives us hope when it comes to the question about how are we going to get interoperability between how different jurisdictions are going to approach this. If they agree on the principles, can they agree on the regulatory approach? Now, not quite, obviously, because regulation means you're putting in place laws, or you may choose to approach this instead through guidelines, or you may focus on saying, well, we've got existing rules and regulations to make sure that society is safeguarded. How do we just update those in order to make them work in the space of AI? And each jurisdiction needs to make those decisions on their own because, of course, they are working with a different set of backgrounds. In the EU, there was a strong rationale for saying we need to put in place new legislation because it's not just one jurisdiction, it's 27 jurisdictions. And if you want to make sure that you're going to get coherence across the 27, it's easier to put in place a new piece of legislation than it is to say we're going to update anti-discrimination legislation in each of the 27 member countries in the same kind of way to work with AI, just as one example. But in other jurisdictions, they face different trade-offs. So that means the way in which they're going to try to update regulations in order to meet these core principles that they basically agree on is going to be different. How then can we still get something that's going to work interjurisdictionally? And that's then a space where standards can play a role, because the regulations, they basically tell you the outcome that you want to reach. They tell you, for instance, you need to have a risk management framework in place. You need to do an assessment of, is this a high risk kind of area of deploying AI or not? And in some jurisdictions, that then translates to you've got certain compliance obligations. In other jurisdictions, that leads to strong guidance recommendations on doing certain things. But the regulation doesn't tell you exactly what actions to take. That's where standards can come in. The standard helps you translate the overall, you're supposed to have a risk management framework into, but what does that actually mean? What is a good risk management framework for AI? And that, to a large extent, brings us back to something which is equal across different jurisdictions. All organizations, no matter what jurisdiction they're in, face the same kind of challenge in how do I know where do I have an AI system? How do I do an assessment of its impact if it were to fail? What kind of governance do I need to have in place to know who has responsibility for what's going on here? How do I have guardrails that will capture, basically build with a mindset of everything is going to fail at some point. How do we make sure that when it does fail, it doesn't lead to catastrophe? Those kinds of things. So this is a space where standards can actually then come in and say, well, even though we have differentiation in the regulatory or policy-making approach to a certain extent, standards can then reharmonize to a certain extent across different jurisdictions by saying, actually, fundamentally, where we're trying to land are these same kind of principles. So this is where standardization, I think, is really important, and where it's great to see that basically everybody is saying we need to be looking at this from an international perspective. Of course, national standards bodies play an important role because they are the mechanism through which experts get brought together in order to participate in regional bodies like SEN and SENELEC, but also in international ones like ISO and IEC. But we're not pursuing a Dean does something completely different for Germany than the Australian standards body does for Australia or something like that. They're all trying to work together in this space and work this out. So this is a little bit the relationship between the regulatory space and standards. But of course, both the regulators and the standards makers, as was already mentioned, are facing these time pressures because, as I said, society is looking at that they want AI to be adopted because it has great potential for the economy, but they want it to be adopted in a safe way. In order to actionably know what that means, we need to have the standards. And we don't just need any old standards, we need standards that can give a sense of certainty that this is the right way of doing it for the foreseeable future, because putting in place a whole new governance framework within an organization is an investment. Putting in place all kinds of additional safeguards is an investment. You want to make sure that you're going to be investing to put in place the right kind of frameworks on the basis of standards that are not going to be changing next year because something else came up. So the standards need to have a certain sense of longevity. Of course, they get reviewed every 4 to 5 years or something, but they need a certain sense of longevity. That means we need good consensus. We need to be able to allow the experts to come together and work on this, to actually go through, well, this looks like the right way of doing things, but no, actually, this other expert from a different discipline perhaps is raising a particular point, and there needs to be space to something needs to be done. So the time pressure is a really difficult one because it's not just a case of how can you write something quick enough. It's really a case of how can we think these things through enough and reflect on them and be able to get enough stakeholders from different backgrounds to be able to reflect on how would this look like in our space? Is this actually something that's going to work? And that is especially a challenge as we are needing to deal with more socio-technical kinds of standards, such as trustworthiness questions that Enrico is greatly engaged in. So one way, and this is something that was already hinted on, is that we need to build a greater reservoir of people who can actively engage in the standardization space. Prior to joining UI, I was an academic. for 17 years. And only in the last couple of years of that did I ever consider anything to do with standardization. The academic space currently is not really built to support that academics think about engaging in standardization. It carries pretty much zero academic credit to be engaging in standardization. This is something that would need to be changed. There needs to be academic career value to engaging in standardization so that we can get this resource of great thinking into the space. We also need support from governments, from policymakers, for NGOs and SMEs to be able to engage in this space, because they can't afford to pay one of their very limited number of staff to be fully engaging in standardization unless they can get support for this. And one example of a direction to go into for this space is the UK's standardization hub, AI Standards Hub, which is collaboration between the PSI, the British Standards Institution, and the Alan Turing Institute, to think through and to provide, first of all, some information and awareness raising to a broader sense of stakeholders around what are standards, how do they even get created, what is their role in society, and to some extent, our current discussion contributes to that. So this is an area that will need support and engagement, thinking through what are active ways in which we can broaden engagement in this space, so that we can start thinking about these things at an earlier stage, giving more time to start developing what a good standard looks like, and we don't get caught between a political agreement to need to push something out quickly that never discussed with the standardization makers whether or not that timeline was realistic. So this is my starting point. I'll hand over to the others, and maybe we'll come back to some of these points later.